OYTV.
Supporters of an independent Western Cape attend a march in Stellenbosch on a blistering summer's day. They're calling for the Western Cape province to split from South Africa and become its own country.
And I'm supporting the Cape Independence movement today, being part of this march, trying to free my nation, to free my customs and my culture, because under the DA and the current ANC governments, I don't think they actually have anything or any plan in place.
Today I would like to invite you all to stay. I would like to invite you all to make a difference, to make history in this country.
This idea of Cape independence is not new, but has in recent months garnered more attention.
I mean, we started this 13 years ago. In 2007, people thought we were crazy. Now it is hot. The Cape Party support has absolutely exploded over the last year or two.
Activist organisation Cape Exit is also calling for an independent Western Cape and has increased its registrations from 7,000 members to 800,000 members in just 1 year. So what would an independent Western Cape look like? It would be a new country with a new name, flag, government and borders. Just think Lesotho by the sea.
If you want to go from the Western Cape, from Cape Town to Johannesburg, you'll have to have a passport. If you want to come and visit, you'll have to have visas like it would be with any other country, like if you go to Namibia at the moment.
And supporters believe it will be highly successful, with better policing, transport and healthcare, benefiting greatly from not being under the ANC's government's rule and racial policies like BEE.
Because at the moment it's difficult for us to get a job as a minority in this country, and obviously I'm not doing it only for my race or any type of race, but for Western Cape, people of Western Cape.
I believe that the Western Cape can be sustainable, self-sustainable. You know, we've got the oceans, we've got the agricultural land, we've got the human capital. We can do this. I think we could turn this into the Monaco of Africa. We could show South Africa how democracy was supposed to work.
The process lives and dies on one principle, that the majority of the Western Cape voters support it. So more than 50% of Western Cape's registered voters, which is roughly 1.6 million people, must support independence. Only then can organizations approach the government and request a referendum. A referendum is a vote on a political question, which in this case would be whether the Western Cape should split from South Africa. Think Brexit. But even if the result of the referendum is in favor of the split from South Africa, the government is still not legally required to act on it, meaning it can simply be ignored. Many believe the government will also not allow a referendum in the first place, which makes sense, as why would the government open up the possibility of losing one of the strongest economies in the country? Independent supporters will then go to the international route, where they will ask the United Nations to get involved. The United Nations can't force South Africa's government to act on anything, but it can make recommendations. But if this too leads nowhere, independent supporters say they will then call on the Western Cape government to declare a UDI, a unilateral declaration of independence. But legal experts say this is a dangerous move.
If they go that route, it could create a civil war, because the army will come in and restore the borders of the country and the constitution proclaimed.
A UDI is a sure way to get sanctions against you, and the very talk of it is completely irresponsible.
I hear so much talk of civil war and violence. I absolutely don't see that. Those that think this isn't a good idea kind of almost want to bully the people that do into not following the democratic processes, but that's not the point. This fundamentally is a democratic process
Other countries have succeeded in independence through a UDI. For example, the United States of America, which split from Great Britain, Belgium, which split from the United Netherlands in 1830, Bangladesh, which split from Pakistan in 1971, and Palestine, which split from Israel in 1988. But the person who would need to allow a referendum in the province is the Western Cape DA Premier, Alan Winde, and he is opposed to the idea.
I hear all this call about, secession, but when you analyze the reason, it's a political reason. People are not happy with the politics. Now, the way to deal with politics is not referendums, it's called the ballot. If you want to go down that path, what happens then when suddenly, this independent Western Cape and suddenly Hout Bay says, no, well, they don't want to be part of Cape Town. You're going to have these 1,000 different separate secessions. You're trying to fix a problem with the wrong tool.
When we look at secessions, other secessions that have been successful around the world, they don't happen because the parent state suddenly just decides it's a good idea. Almost secession is always kind of opposed. It ends up being a political negotiation, and fundamentally our rights come because as the people of the Western Cape, all 7 million of us, whatever race we may be, whatever religion we may be, we have a choice to decide for ourselves.
A lot of people that say it's not possible but can't provide it with the facts because the Constitution allows it, international law, they allow it. So it's definitely possible, and I do believe we will achieve it. It might not be now. This is only a start, but it's a statement.
But those opposing independence believe this whole concept is simply a pipe dream.
In the Western Cape, people would have to set up a border patrol. We can't even keep Sylvester the lion in the Western Cape. How are we going to keep people from crossing that border? It is well within their constitutional right to advocate for anything they want. I honestly wish them the best, but I do not think they will succeed or secede. I don't think that's on the cards.
If you have a new state, you have to create all the trappings of a new state. It needs to have a military, it needs to have a police force, it needs to have a home affairs, it needs to have all these government functions, which would have to be created from scratch. Practically a nightmare. It's almost impossible to do, but it will cost billions of rands. This is a pipe dream, and that is not going to happen, so that people are not that disappointed when it doesn't happen.
In politics, there's one word you never use, and that's never. All the newspapers says that the ANC will never rule this country. They even wanted to kick Botha out for just suggesting there might be a black president sometime. Okay, and today we have a black president.
I don't believe that freedom will be bloodless. I believe that there will be a great cost. Now, I'm asking the people pushing for this freedom, are you prepared to pay that cost? When we speak independence, we have to ask the pivotal question, why are we doing this? We are speaking on behalf of what? 6 million coloured people in the Western Cape. What's in it for them? There will be no independence without the coloured people. It's just that simple.
I mean, I'm a proud South African, and then I say to myself, well, come on guys, let's fix the country. That's what we've got to do.
Will people feel they turn their backs on South Africa in terms of patriotism? No, I don't think so. At the moment, we're living from a sporting event to sporting event. To actually say this is our identity, this is who we are, it is far beyond that. I think the people out there is praying for a solution to the problems. It's much closer than what people realize.
OYTV.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to address you on a subject which is not only close to my heart, but also which is one beginning to play a significant role in Western Cape and by extension South African politics. And our theme for today is what is driving support for Cape independence and what might the political impact be. But before I start though, I'd just like to make one point. That Cape independence is about what is best for the people of the Western Cape, and it's a decision for them and them alone to make. Whilst most of us have friends and relatives in the rest of South Africa and will always have a special bond with South Africa, what is best for the rest of South Africa and the people who live there is not the responsibility of Western Cape voters. Responsibility for the rest of South Africa lies with the voters who live there. If it transpires today that your lasagna was more interesting than me, I want you to please just remember this one sentence. We have a problem that Cape independence will fix when nothing else will. We have a problem that Cape independence will fix when nothing else will. And if you understand this sentiment, then you understand what drives support for Cape independence. I don't think I need to stand here and explain to anybody in this room the problems that are currently facing South Africa. But what does seem to get forgotten, however, and on a fairly regular basis, is that 8 South African provinces have consistently voted in favour of those problems, whilst the 9th province has consistently voted for a solution. The Western Cape has never given the ANC a majority in the province, yet the ANC are currently making all of the crucial policy decisions affecting the lives of every Western Cape citizen, with just 28.6% of the vote. I talk a lot about Cape independence, and one fascinating observation is just how scared people are to engage with the big picture. There's comfort, it seems, in hiding behind the technicalities. How are you going to protect the borders? The ANC are never going to allow it. It's never going to happen. Well, what is the big picture? Well, it's ideological. The Western Cape and the rest of South Africa fundamentally want different things. Sure, perhaps we want similar outcomes, but we're worlds apart when it comes to what we think must be done to solve our problems. Political analysts make the mistake of looking at either provinces in isolation or South Africa as a whole. But what they typically don't do is examine the Western Cape and then compare it to the rest of South Africa. And I'd like to suggest that if they did, we'd all understand our political reality a little better. For example, whilst the ANC received its lowest ever share of the vote in the Western Cape in 2019, in the rest of South Africa, the ANC and the EFF combined achieved their highest ever share of the vote. And the notion that South Africa is somehow slowly coming to its senses simply isn't true. Outside the Western Cape, 73.1% of voters opted for racial socialism. And South Africa is becoming more radicalized. It's crucial that we understand this because it helps us to understand our we. We, the people of the Western Cape, have a problem because you, the people of the rest of South Africa, keep inflicting that problem upon us every time there's an election. And in the context of a unified South African state, we, the people of the Western Cape, are utterly powerless to stop you. Well, that's democracy, you might say. And of course, you'd be right. Our elections have been broadly free and fair, and no one is suggesting that despite their many faults, the ANC is anything other than the democratically and legitimately elected government of South Africa. Democracy. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. But does the Western Cape have democracy? Well, there's a very strong argument that the Western Cape does not have functional democracy. If you don't have the government that the majority of your people voted for, but instead you have the government you've done everything in your power to reject, and you have no realistic prospect of ever getting the government that you actually want, do you have functional democracy? And as a consequence of our democratic problem, we then have an ideological problem. The Western Cape has emphatically demonstrated at the ballot box that it favours non-racialism and a market economy, where the rest of South Africa does not. And those students of history among us will understand how non-racialism is woven into the liberal traditions of the Cape. Because of our ideological problem, we then have tangible physical problems, and we continue to labour under the burden of poverty, of unemployment, and of crime. In the Western Cape, 33% of our population live below the upper international poverty line. And in the Western Cape, even pre-COVID, 21% of our population were unemployed. And were the Western Cape to become an independent state today, we would have the second highest murder rate in the world, behind only El Salvador. So in the Western Cape, we have a problem. We have a problem that Cape independence can fix. Cape independence would, for the very first time in history, allow the people of the Western Cape as a whole, regardless of their race, religion, or culture, to elect the government of their own choosing. Equally important, Cape independence would allow the people of the Western Cape to unelect the government if it doesn't perform. The Western Cape would have functional democracy. And through functional democracy, the Western Cape would then be free to embrace the ideology of non-racialism and a market economy. And in doing so, it would then be equipped to address poverty, unemployment, and crime in a meaningful way, offering hope and the realistic prospect of a better life for all the people of the Western Cape. John Steenhuisen says that many people are calling for independence because they've seen how well the DA governs. And to be fair to him, I think there's a lot of truth in this. Compared to South Africa as a whole, the people of the Western Cape are less likely to live in poverty, less likely to be unemployed, less likely to die in early childhood, more likely to pass matric, and more likely to obtain a tertiary qualification. But I think in making his claim, John has missed two vitally important points. Firstly, the only reason the DA were in a position to show how well they could govern the Western Cape was because, first of all, the people of the Western Cape were in a position to elect them. Without Cape independence, even if they want to, the people of the Western Cape cannot elect a national DA government, whilst the people of the rest of South Africa have made it abundantly clear that they don't want a DA national government. And secondly, whilst the Western Cape outperforms the rest of South Africa, it lags far behind its international peers, better than the incompetent, corrupt, shambolic mess which South Africa has become is not the yardstick by which the Western Cape should be measuring itself. If the Western Cape wants to perform on a par or better than its peers, it simply cannot have an ANC-led government, coalition or otherwise, making its decisions for it. We have a problem that Cape independence can fix when nothing else will. So what other solutions would solve the Western Cape's problems? The DA is proposing federalism. So would this fix the problem? Setting aside the fact that procedurally, federalism would actually be harder to deliver than independence, who would be left controlling economic policy and the national budget in a federal South Africa? Can the Western Cape realistically resolve poverty and unemployment without first having control over economic policy, and leaving it instead to the 73% of voters in the rest of South Africa who wish to place it in the hands of either the ANC or the EFF? Who would control the constitution and the prevailing ideology? Catalonia's thus far unsuccessful attempts to obtain independence are never far from the lips of those wishing to discourage advocates for Cape independence. But how many people are aware that the recent clashes in Catalonia were sparked when on the 28th of June 2010, the Spanish Constitutional Court struck down sections of the 2006 Statute of Autonomy of Catalonia, after it had been passed by the Catalan Parliament and ratified by Spain's National Assembly. It took Spain just 4 years to take away the autonomous rights it had given to Catalonia. And in a parallel that I'm sure is lost on no one, the downgrading of the Catalan language was the most controversial issue. Professor Koos Malan, Professor of Public Law at the University of Pretoria, is on record as saying that whilst we can still get a procedurally fair judgment in the South African Constitutional Court, it is already no longer possible to get an ideologically fair judgment. So federalism would be almost impossible to achieve, would still leave the South African national government in charge of economic policy, and could be revoked or amended by an ideologically compromised constitutional court. Does that sound like a better solution for the people of the Western Cape than having our own government, making our own decisions, and having our own ideologically fair legal system? Federalism would allow the Western Cape to enact damage limitation. It would in all likelihood allow it to do so more effectively, but it certainly does not prevent another territory which is ideologically distinct from us dominating. In turn, it will leave the issues of poverty and unemployment largely unresolved. If the DA want federalism, what about the ANC and the EFF? Well, of course, the ANC and the EFF don't want to fix the problem. The ANC governs with 28.6% of the vote. For them, Cape independence would be the problem. They are African nationalists, and the prospect of a sub-Saharan Africa is an anathema to them, regardless of the democratic will of the people who live there. The only other solution on offer is coalition politics, and I'm not sure we need to dwell too long on the merits of that. Not only have we seen all too vividly the pitfalls of coalition government, but why would the people of the Western Cape risk everything on a wild throw of the dice when they can just have the government of their own choosing? So what is driving support for Cape independence? We have a problem that Cape independence can fix when nothing else will. This is what is driving support for Cape independence. Before I move on to the second part of our theme for today, I want to touch briefly on a word I've used several times in my speech already. And it's a concept that is the source of intense debate in South Africa: non-racialism. Non-racialism is a founding principle of the organisation I represent, the Cape Independence Advocacy Group. And it's also a policy adopted last year by the party of provincial government, the DA. Few people in South Africa openly embrace racism, and those that do are generally rounded upon from all sides. But non-racialism is far more controversial. Racism that seeks to undo the damage of racism isn't actually racism. This is the prevailing political view in South Africa, and this argument is almost exclusively focused on black or white. But the largest racial group in the Western Cape are the so-called coloured people, who, according to both the apartheid government and the current one, are neither black nor white. And in coloured communities, too black for the last government and too white for this one is a popular refrain. Independence polling shows that 60% of all independent supporters are coloured, whilst Cape Exit, a leading civic organisation with almost 800,000 registered independent supporters, also claim that 60% of those who've signed a mandate with them for Cape independence are coloured. So I would like to ask that for a moment, each person in this room pause and reflect on the issues that are uniquely faced by the coloured people in the Western Cape. And this is what Judge Nugent had to say in the Constitutional Court about their plight. In the Western Cape, 9 of each 100 work opportunities are made accessible to some 2.8 million coloured people, whilst 1.9 million black African people have access to 73. 9 out of 100 for coloured people, 73 out of 100 for black African people. These comments, of course, refer to the national government policy of affirmative action, and I'd like you to just please consider this. Were affirmative action to be implemented on the basis of language rather than skin colour, people would understand the plight of the coloured people in the Western Cape infinitely better. I will leave you to imagine what the outcome would be of informing KwaZulu-Natal that 15% of all jobs in the province must go to Xhosa speakers, and that 25% of all Eastern Cape jobs must go to Zulu speakers. I think we can all imagine how that would work out. So then why do we do it to coloured people? I'm just now going to move on to the second part of the theme for today. What might the political impact of Cape independence be? Cape independence is a political market disruptor. Since 1994, political debate has largely taken place within the context of party politics. But Cape independence is not a concept being driven by political parties. It is an idea being driven by an active citizenry who are seeking to reject the system that they believe isn't working for them. In the Western Cape, the status quo is the DA, who are in their third straight term as the provincial government. They are the system, and that has set the DA and the independence movement on a collision course. In August 2020, the CIAG commissioned Victory Research to conduct the first major poll on Cape independence. It showed that 65% of independent supporters vote DA, and it showed that 64% of Western Cape DA voters would support a referendum on Cape independence. The independence movement must go through the DA to win independence, whilst the DA cannot maintain its provincial majority without independent supporters voting for them in significant numbers. Between now and the next provincial election in 2024, unless the DA and the independence movement can find a way to accommodate each other, this is a political battle which will inevitably come to a head. In his book, Diffusion of Innovations, Professor Everett Rogers defined the process through which ideas are adopted. And he categorized those adopting ideas into one of 5 groups: innovators, early adopters, the early majority, the late majority, and laggards. And at some point, he says, if an idea is to be adopted, it must achieve what he calls critical mass. We have already discussed how Cape independence is being driven by those who perceive it to be a solution to serious problems which are rapidly worsening. Using Rogers' definition, Cape independence has entered the early majority stage, but has not yet achieved critical mass, and he defines critical mass as the point where the rate of adoption becomes self-sustaining. And to achieve critical mass, the independence movement must overcome or faces 2 significant challenges. Firstly, it needs to convince would-be supporters that independence is actually achievable. In the poll, 74% of Western Cape DA voters and 80% of all Western Cape voters did not believe that the ANC would ever allow independence. Then secondly, it needs to convince primarily DA voters that voting against the DA for a pro-independence party would not allow the ANC back into power provincially, but would instead force the DA into a referendum on Cape independence. The DA, on the other hand, needs to convince independent supporters that no matter how badly flawed it may be, their best option still lies with the current system and by them continuing to vote DA. But the DA faces significant challenges of its own. Firstly, they haven't got much fat built into their provincial majority. In the independence poll, 15% of Western Cape DA voters indicated they were willing to vote against the DA if they opposed Cape independence. And in 2019, had everything else remained the same, that would have left the DA with 47% of the vote. Then the DA are very exposed on provincial issues. There is no benefit to the people of the Western Cape to remain in a relationship with South Africa. What does the Western Cape get out of that relationship? We get a government that we don't want, and as one of only 2 net income producing provinces, we get a bill for the privilege. The DA knows that the Western Cape would be better off alone, and it isn't even trying to argue otherwise. When independence first emerged as a political issue, the DA focused instead on the practical problems that obtaining independence would present. More recently, it's switched tack, and over the last 12 months, we've seen the DA visibly strengthen its resolve to obtaining greater provincial autonomy for the Western Cape. And it's now trying to sell some watered down version of independence, which will be more palatable to the 69% of DA voters who live outside of the Western Cape. And therein lies the rub. What is best for the rest of South Africa and what is best for the Western Cape may not be the same thing. Although ironically, I would strongly suggest that an independent Cape would be excellent news for South Africa. The DA has a winning hand in the Western Cape. If they want to, they can call for a referendum tomorrow. Instead, they are pulling their punches and selling their own Western Cape voters short, the majority of whom they themselves acknowledge support independence. They're trying to sell a compromise that solves their problems, but not ours as Western Cape residents. They are trying to not upset their Western Cape voters. And on this issue, I believe the DA are going to be ruthlessly exposed. They rightly accuse the ANC of putting party before state, but the DA are putting party before province, and independent supporters know it. What the DA really wants is for talk of independence to go away. They want it to merge into their calls for greater autonomy, but it won't. Not least because the DA cannot actually deliver any meaningful degree of greater autonomy. Instead, calls for independence are getting ever closer to critical mass, and more of the DA's political opponents are choosing to enter the fray. The Freedom Front Plus have already joined the Cape Party in campaigning outright for independence. The Cape Coloured Congress is stoking the flames of coloured nationalism, highlighting the devastating effects of affirmative action, provincial migration, and housing policy on the coloured population of the Western Cape. Behind the scenes, other political parties are now privately making overtures to the independence movement. And there is even talk of a single-issue referendum party being formed. Providing they go ahead as planned, the first round in the battle for independence will be fought in this year's municipal elections. If the DA can maintain support at 2019 levels and convince Western Cape voters that its plan is more viable than independence, then it will probably start to believe that it can weather the independence storm. But on the other hand, if the independence movement can draw sufficient support away from the DA and leave it staring down the barrel of minority provincial government in 2024, then I strongly suspect we will see a significant shift in DA policy towards meaningful public engagement on the issue and ultimately a referendum on Cape independence.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you for gracing us.
Keep on.
I just need to know whether you are a constitutionalist or a revolutionary. Because if you're a constitutionalist, you have to accept the supremacy of our constitution and the rule of law, and you have to find a way to pass the provision in the constitution that says that self-determination for the Western Cape is a matter of national legislation, which, on the numbers you've given us today, ain't gonna happen.
Thank you. Well, I think I'm both a constitutionalist and a revolutionary. Let me explain. At this point in time, I'm standing here in South Africa, and therefore I'm bound by the terms of the South African Constitution, and therefore I'm a constitutionalist. But the Constitution, by its very nature, is a pact between the people and the state. And fundamentally, the people of the Western Cape, if they so choose, can elect out of that pact and decide that they would rather not be part of South Africa and would rather be an independent state. And obviously then at that situation, they would look to the provisions of international law. And I'm sure you're aware of the 2010 declaration by the International Court of Justice that said there is no prohibition in international law on the unilateral declaration of independence. And ultimately, I see the Western Cape, or Cape independence, providing that we have the democratic will of the people in the Western Cape, as being a negotiated political solution that is neither constitutional nor revolutionary, but a bit of both.
Professor Anthony Butler.
Thank you very much, Bill, for wide-ranging vision. I wanted to ask about some of the detail, particularly about the new technologies that might help you to achieve your vision. So I assume you confirm that you're not planning to build a wall around the but you will presumably be seeking to give the citizens of the Western Cape particular rights. And that might include rights to public services that are different from the rights of what famously described refugees, but also rights to work within the country of their citizenship, the Western Cape. So I'm wondering if you think that new technologies like our phones could allow us to have, for example, a Cape Labour preference policy, and that CLPP could be something that would be built into our phones. So when we went for a job or to get public services from the municipality, we will be able to show our phone.
Thank you, and I have to say I'm very flattered that you would ask me a question on technology. There are going to be some knowing faces in the room who are chuckling very deep down, because I certainly wouldn't be proposing any technological solutions. I think there are two parts to your question. First of all, I think just to understand the role of the Cape Independence Advocacy Group, we are not particularly advocating for any set positions on independence. And I think within the population of the Western Cape, there's going to be a very wide and varied selection of policy preferences for people. What we're fighting for is the people of the Western Cape to be able to elect the government they want. And I think in the first election that comes along post-independence, then the people of the Western Cape will choose the government, and those parties will determine policies. But of course, in terms of technology, I think there would be an ideal opportunity if you're at the birth of a new country to be able to embrace new technologies, and I'm sure that absolutely would be the case. I agree with you. We don't envisage a Trump-type wall, no.
Oh, hello. Yes, you.
I'm just asking whether the independence movement is happy with the present borders of the province of the Western Cape. I know in conversation with Jack Below, the Kent party, a few years ago, they were talking about including the Northern Cape as part of their sort of independence move, so that the western part of South Africa would be what they would be visiting. And I also said you've got the Cape parties very
Thank you. Yes, look, this is a question we get asked a lot. So our focus is exclusively on the Western Cape, and it's exclusively on the Western Cape initially because of the requirements under international law of a defined population, a defined territory. And obviously one of our main arguments for Cape independence is the ideological differences between the Western Cape and the rest of South Africa. And they've been expressed at the ballot box. So we can look at 3 decades worth of election results and say that the Western Cape clearly wants something different to the rest of South Africa. That is much harder to achieve elsewhere, because clearly we can see, for example, in the case of the Northern Cape, that it votes ANC. So it's much harder to argue that the ANC wants to be that the Northern Cape wants to be independent from the government itself has elected. What I do think was likely to happen is once we get to the point in time where we've got close to a referendum and a potential independence, that there'll be discussion about what happens along those borders. Fundamentally, we're an organisation that supports, and all of the independence groups with us are democratic in nature. So we're not seeking anything other than the democratic will of the people. So we're seeking initially the democratic will of the people of the Western Cape. Then I think after that, there is a discussion along the borders to say people who just fall outside of that border, what happens if the majority of people in that district or that municipality also wish to be part. And I don't know how we resolve that. That isn't something that's the plan at the moment. But I can tell you that for the reasons of reasons of demonstrating the ideological differences and for complying with the defined territory and population, we're starting with the Western Cape.
Hi, Paul. Thank you for coming. In your August poll last year, it said that 34 or 5% wanted secession immediately. It said 47% wanted a referendum. That was in August last year. Since August last year, in 9 months, Cape exit registration went up by 400,000. If the voting population in the Western Cape would say, let's say, 3.5 million, 1% would be 35,000. So 47% of the Western Cape wanted secession 9 months ago, and just one organisation, Cape Exit, has gone up by 400,000 registrations post-poll. That would translate to 10% of the population. So that would mean 47% that wanted a referendum now is at least at 57%, which is past the 51% mark. Plus your organisations, my organisations, the ULA, they've all grown by thousands, tens of thousands of awareness since your poll 9 months ago. So why are we waiting to get to 1.6 million? And why not put pressure on Wiki right now to start to call a referendum like I'm currently doing? Because once you get to 1.6, you're going to start the process of Wiki, which takes quite a while to get your paperwork. So my question is, why are we waiting for the 1.6s if we know mathematically if your numbers are correct from your poll and Cape Exit's registration are correct, we guarantee already to be well over 50%.
Thank you. Look, I think that's I think you're I'm trying to be polite here, but I think you've conflated a number of different issues here. So first of all, we poll. So how polling works is you take a representative sample of the population. So and it was independent polling. We employed Victory Research. They didn't poll everybody in the Western Cape, but they polled a demographically representative sample, and they extrapolated to how many people. So at that point in time, broadly speaking, the poll suggested that somewhere in the region of 1.1 million people supported Cape independence. It was 36% of the population. Obviously, Cape Exit are busy signing up people for a mandate for Cape independence. So arguably at that point in time, you would say there were potentially 1.1 million people who are willing to support Cape independence, of which at the time Cape Exit had signed up 400,000, and they've now signed up 800,000. You obviously can't count those people twice. They're the same people. So you know, I don't know what the outcome, we haven't polled, and we will poll again later this year. But my personal opinion is that we're still some way short of a majority support for Cape independence in the Western Cape. I think there probably has been some increase, but I don't think we'd win an independence referendum if it was held today. That's my personal opinion.
My name is Mary again. Actually, the past years, I'm not representing articles. 2 questions. I'm taking advantage because I'm a woman. One, go for the middle route for now of self-determination, like the money in Victoria. And secondly, if you impress that the movement is non-racial, focuses on non-racialism, sorry, why are you singling, or one of the points that you're singling out is the so-called coloured line?
Sorry, can you just repeat? So I got the first part was effectively why did we settle for federalism, a halfway house? Or,
self-determination, which is allowed in the Constitution of Uganda and Canada. Working in the extended Eastern so yeah, self-determination like Uganda and Canada in Victoria, one local and then as focusing on non-racialism, why are we specifically in one of the points to single out a certain colored light? So I'm just seeing
sure. Okay. All right. So no. Okay. Thank you. No, I get that now. So in terms of self-determination, we'll look. So Irania, I don't know much about the place of Pretoria, but I do know a fair bit about Irania. And obviously Irania is seeking cultural self-determination. It's Afrikaner self-determination. But that's not what we're seeking in the Western Cape. We are seeking an inclusive, we want to have the government that we vote for. So actually we're seeking independence on the basis of everybody in the Western Cape, regardless of their race, religion and culture. So therefore it's not a comparable situation. We want to win this for everybody, whether they're black, white, coloured, Indian, Asian, doesn't matter to us. The bottom line is for 30 years almost, we've been voting for the government that we want and we can't get it. And we've got no realistic prospect of ever getting the government that we want. And at some point, if you can't get the government you want, what do you do? We must just go our separate ways. In terms of non-racialism, I accept that there's multiple definitions of non-racialism. And I think from the why do we speak about coloured people, I think that probably is a fair question. But we're speaking out of trying to make sure that those issues are understood, because I think there is a move to try and to actually try and make independence about Afrikaners, or to make it about white people, or to make it about capitalists, or to make it about, and that's not the case. And I think there's an understanding that the majority of the largest cultural group, the largest ethnic group in the Western Cape is the coloured people, and I think they uniquely suffer under the South African Constitution. So those comments were particularly in relation to affirmative action, because I think often as a white person and people in my circle of friends who aren't coloured don't fully understand the implications of affirmative action, because we don't suffer it as a white person. We're equally spread throughout South Africa, so we don't suffer that particular discrimination that coloured people suffer. So empathy, I guess, is why I've raised coloured people in that point.
Hello everyone, my name is Steve Jones and I represent Race Sympathy. Firstly, thank you both for working for and the work that you do at the Advocacy Group. I have two one questions and notes, and secondly is a question. Firstly, the Independent Electoral Commission, would they be the ones that would be in charge of holding such a referendum? That in consideration, and we consider who the commission was of the Independent Electoral Commission and how they are ultimately appointed by the national government. There will be some of the conflict of interest in terms of who would be the parties who would ultimately organise such a referendum. Firstly, that's the one which was asked. How would one go about organising such a referendum? Because the person considers not just some of the numbers which you mentioned, the sentiment that has been growing across the last years in the Western Cape, which are currently the majority. They feel very much in favour of the independence of the Western Cape. But further, that consideration, the other pitfall that has been experienced by the Scottish independence referendum was that it failed, and because it was instituted, the national government within the UK doesn't, essentially to postpone any idea of trying to run another referendum again because the sentiment was no longer proven. So these are just 2 points that I want to ask. Is that firstly the IEC and who would organise such a referendum, and then if a referendum failed, what would that mean? Because ultimately you need 50% plus one. Sure. And yeah, those are my questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Look, in terms of the mechanics of the referendum, I'm not the best person to ask. Yes, I assume it will be operated by the IEC, but I mean our focus isn't on the details of how the referendum is going to be conducted at this point in time. It's just drumming up enough support to make sure that we can get one and win it. When it comes to your second question about Scotland, look, our organisation is fundamentally democratic. We want independence based on the democratic will of the people of the Western Cape. And actually, we accept that you can win and lose in that scenario. We're not looking to overthrow the system. So if we call a referendum and we lose the referendum, then we lose the referendum. That was the democratic will of the people. We're not looking to force through our views on anybody else. And I think it's an interesting question that comes up, and it's one of the challenges that I often have. A lot of people focus allegations or throw allegations out at the independence movement, but fundamentally, all of us, whether it's Cape Exit or the Cape Party or it's the Freedom Front or it's us, what we want is a referendum, a democratic referendum, where the people of the Western Cape get to say what they want. And I think from that point of view, what's immoral, what's unreasonable about that, and what is it that other parties have got to hide, that they're scared of asking the people of the Western Cape what they want? Dr. Mulder?
Thank you very much. I'll ask you 3 questions.
Short one.
Yeah, sure. The first one would be, would you agree that the end goal, what we are saying with is not the referendum? Sorry, the end? Yes, thank you. Now, the question I want to ask is that would you agree that the end goal is not the referendum? The end goal is independence and freedom to address the issues that we have. That's the first question. The second one, would you agree with me that successful independence or national freedom, whatever you want to call the movements, who succeeded, did not call for a referendum until they knew they could win the referendum? Because the stakes are so high, we don't play around with this. Last question. Would you agree that even if the Premier is now pressurized to call a referendum, and can do so in terms of the Constitution as well as the Constitution of the Western Cape, you cannot actually do so because the current Referendums Act in South Africa is currently unconstitutional. It needs to be amended. And one need to have to do all the homework before you get to that point. 2 questions. Thank you.
Remind me what the middle one was. Well, let me answer the 2 I can remember, and then I'll get this. So first of all, yes, I absolutely agree with you. Look, the referendum is the mechanism, but the end goal is for the people of the Western Cape to be able to see the ideology that they believe in enacted, and ultimately, beyond even that, to see the problems that we have as a province fixed, to see poverty and unemployment and crime, the 3 issues we singled out, fixed in the province, so we can all live a better and more decent life. Your last question was about yes, in terms of when to call a referendum. I remember now. Absolutely, there's no point in calling a referendum to lose it, and so I agree with you entirely. So now I forgot your last one was about the unconstitutionality. Yeah. So you're a doctor in constitutional law, and I most definitely am not. So, but as I understand the process, exactly that is that the enabling legislation has never been enacted to give power to the constitutional right of the Western Cape Premier to call a referendum. And before a referendum could take place, then that unconstitutional law would need to be rectified.
Okay, if there are no more questions, can I ask one, please? Certainly within my children's lifetime, the majority of the Western Cape population will be Black African. Don't you have a bit of a race against time?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. So first of all, is there an issue? We go out of our way to make Cape independence not an issue about race. I think for us it's ideological. You'll see that our rationale absolutely is that is based on the election results of 30 years that clearly demonstrate that the people of the Western Cape want something that's fundamental for the people of South Africa. And therefore, why can't the people of South Africa have the government that they want, and the people of the Western Cape to have the government that we want? Why do we stay forever bound in this colonial construct of South Africa, which was made in 1910, rather than just breaking up the country and letting one part of the country have what it wants and the other part of the country have what it wants? What the population is in terms of race is what the population is as race. Our differences are ideological. Now, ultimately, the Western Cape is far more diverse than the rest of South Africa ethnically, and that will be the case with or without independence, and actually absolutely no problem with that whatsoever.
It's Christian with this year from the back. The question I want to ask is what political parties are for this loose coalition of the Cape independence movement And in the upcoming municipal election, how do you think this coalition will do in the election? Can you make a prediction today?
I could probably answer one part of the question much better than the other. Parties that are involved, the Cape Party, we're the founder of the independence dream, let's say it. So the Cape Party have been pushing for independence, I think, since 2007. The Freedom Front have obviously always been pushing for self-determination, and last year openly came out in support of Cape independence. There's the two parties that have publicly declared their hand on Cape independence. Privately, the Cape Coloured Congress, the leader of the Cape Coloured Congress, Fadil Adams, has declared his support for Cape independence. They haven't yet held a conference where they've ratified that decision, but I think you can take as read that the Cape Coloured Congress will also. So there'll be at least 3 political parties pushing for Cape independence, and perhaps more.
Let's take a final question over there.
I understand that we're in South Africa and the context and the racism and everything is a hugely hot topic. But my understanding is a 51-year-old black woman in Newly Cape Town. I'm very aware of the Western Cape's history, of which we are very, very proud of. For me, a white and coloured province, country, whatever you want to call it, okay? And for me, the reason that I would like a referendum is to be away from the west of South Africa and many of the people that I know, is that we have elements in the room called the townships that are growing, and we're expected to support them with our rights. So, could someone help me out with that, considering what happened to our beautiful city this weekend, and the fact that we've got a Tanzanian who's been here since 2013, wandering around, and there are many more of them.
Okay, look, so let me first of all put my colours on the mast then. I'm an immigrant to the Western Cape. I didn't grow up in the Western Cape, and I came here because I thought I could get a better life here. And therefore, at no point in any possible way am I going to judge anybody else who comes to the Western Cape seeking a better life. I think that I did the same thing, and I think people who stand up and make decisions for the good of their family need to be applauded and not criticised. But where I think that touches on the issue and perhaps intersects with what you're saying is the other side of that equation, is that when people come here, they must abide by the law, and I think the lawlessness is perhaps more of an issue. And I think the other issue is, and it touched on those comments that were in the Constitutional Court, and I think for me more the problem is not that people are migrating to the Western Cape for the chance of a better life. Where I personally have an issue is that the migrants to the Western Cape are being advantaged by national legislation to the point in time where, as we said in that Constitutional Court judgment, that out of every 100 jobs, 9 are being given to coloured people, and 73 out of 100 are being given to black people. And from my point of view, that's the injustice there. So in terms of migration, I have no issue at all with that.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed. This is necessarily a contentious and divisive subject, but thank you very much indeed for forwarding the debate this afternoon the way you have. Thank you very much.
OYTV.